Good afternoon, or maybe it's morning where you are. My name is Kat Roskovics, and I'm going to be your host on this week's QuickBooks Enterprise Deep Dive webinar. Today, we're going to be talking through user rights and roles in QuickBooks. So how to access them, how to modify them, kind of the view from one user that you might set up. And we'll go from there. We're going to go ahead and get started. So let's get into it. So some topics that we're going to cover today when discussing user rights and roles. We're going to talk about how to access it. What are those default roles? Modifying existing ones, creating new ones, and also talk through the view as a non-admin user. All right, so I've just got a Sandbox QuickBooks Enterprise file open here, and I am logged in as the admin user. So first and foremost, to access our user rights and roles, we're going to go up to the company menu at the top, and we're going to go to users and set up users and roles. Now, one thing that you'll notice, I have to again log in as the admin user with that password. And what you'll notice if you have worked in Pro or Premier in the past, this menu here is going to look quite a bit different, and that's because we can get much more granular with our role creation and user permissions creation in QuickBooks Enterprise than we can in Pro or Premier. So I can see here users, right? I'm logged in as admin, and we're just going to go ahead and, well, actually first let's go ahead and click on the permissions for admin. Let's see here. I'm sorry, user. There we go. Okay. So we're going to go over here to our role list. And these are all roles that come kind of predefined in the software. So when you first start a new QuickBooks Enterprise file, you will get access to all of the roles that we have listed here. And so if I pick on accountant as an example, that's a role that's already set up. But if I wanted to kind of view what's in that role, right, what permissions are in that role, I can click on view permissions, and I could click on accountant, and I could say display. And that's going to show me, you know, all of the permissions that a user that is assigned to that accountant role would have access to. You can also view roles by user, and we'll take a look at that in a second. So that's kind of a list, but if we wanted to actually get into the details, because you saw on that screen before, some of them said mixed, right? So if I look at banking as an example, I can see exactly which permissions any user that is assigned to that accountant role will have access to. So they don't have access to bank feeds, which is a little odd because they're the accountant, right? Maybe they would need access to that. So if I wanted to modify that, I could just by switching it to full. Now you'll notice here that some of these circles are either not filled in at all or only partially filled in. So what that means is if I look at banking, you can see here that I've got mixed access for those. But if I now look at bank feeds, I have full access. If I look at my bank registers, right, I can see those two bubbles are both filled all the way in. So that means I've got full access to those. For checks, as an example, I can view. So some of the areas and activities that you'll see over here on the left have many different options as far as what a user could do with a particular transaction. And some of them are more either you have it or you don't, right? Full access to bank feeds or no access to bank feeds. So if I were to go back and click on checks, right, a user that's assigned to that accountant role would be able to view checks, but they cannot create new ones. They cannot modify existing ones. They cannot delete them, and they also cannot print them. So if I wanted to make any changes here, maybe I wanted them to be able to also create new or modify, but I don't want them to have access to delete, I can make those changes here. If I wanted to give them complete full access to checks, you can see if I fill in that bubble right there, then it gives them access to all of those pieces. And then of course, if I didn't want them to have access to checks at all, then I could say none. So we're gonna go ahead and say full. And so one thing that's important to note is that these areas here, you can see how they're kind of organized by these headings. These more or less tie to our menus across the top. So that can also help when you're trying to identify what permissions you want to include in a particular role. Just think about how you navigate to get there, right? There's sometimes 3 different ways to get to the same area of QuickBooks, but think about which menu you would be accessing that from. So if I'm on our banking menu, right, these are the functions that will exist underneath that banking menu, and that's why they're listed here. If I look at my centers as an example, I have the customer center, right? So a user assigned to that accountant role would be able to view the customer center. They'd be able to view the balance, but they couldn't create new ones, modify or delete existing customers. Company, right? Company menu is at the top up here. And so you'll see that we've got some options from that company menu, like planning and budgeting, right? Definitely want to be looking at that. So setting up budgets and forecasting, that's another area, right? There's not view, print, modify, because it's not really a transaction. It's either you have access or you don't. Customers and receivables. So again, tying to that menu across the top, you can kind of see what access points are here, not invoices or transactions. So you have, you know, flexibility in the rights there, or you can just do full access, again, giving people partial. They can create or delete, but they can't modify, etc. Employees and payroll. So that's a big one. If you do have payroll set up inside of QuickBooks, then definitely making sure that you've only got users that should be able to access payroll or able to access payroll. One thing that I always mention to clients, if you're using any sort of outside payroll provider like ADP, Paychex, Paylocity, etc., and you are entering that information into QuickBooks, usually you're bringing that in as a journal entry. Sometimes you might be bringing it in using a different transaction type, but it's important to note that, you know, if somebody has access to view journal entries, then they would have access to view journal entries that you're bringing in or entering in, whether they're for payroll or other types of month-end adjusting entries. So you want to also think about how you're entering that payroll journal entry, because if we had it broken out as an example by employee, then they would theoretically be able to look at that journal entry and determine, you know, how much John is getting paid compared to Jane. So you got to think about that as well. And even if you're bringing over, you know, like recreating paychecks in QuickBooks as regular checks because you're not using payroll through QuickBooks, then those checks, if they have access to view checks, then they have access to view all checks. You can't say, well, I want them to see these checks, but not these checks, right? So you just got to think about that as well. So then continuing on, looking at our, from our file menu, right? If we want our account to be able to back up, most of these are going to be full or none, right? Because they're not really transactions, but more features or activities, as they like to call them up here. And then we have just our list. So this is an area where we definitely recommend doing some permissions around, because, you know, while we have a chart of accounts, we definitely would want people to be able to view that list. We don't want to give people access, or everyone access maybe, to add accounts to our chart of accounts, because we want to be strategic when we're looking at creating new accounts. So if, you know, we have full access here, if somebody is entering in a transaction and they do a keystroke error or whatever, and they get that pop up and they bypass it, then you can sometimes end up with extra stuff in your chart of accounts that you don't intend to be there. Same thing with these other lists as well, right? So if we have a very standard item list, We only want one person to be able to, you know, update that list, or one role of people that might be assigned to that role. We wouldn't want, you know, somebody to be able to just willy-nilly add stuff to our items list. So these are some areas that lists is super important to make sure that, you know, only people that should be adding to those lists can. So let's look at reports here. So reports, kind of similar. You know, reports is a menu up here, but then it's also broken out into these different sections. So, you know, giving someone access to vendors and payables reports is going to give them access to all of the reports that are under that vendors and payables section from our reports dropdown. Time tracking, right? Those are definitely transactions. So being able to view or create them, view them, etc. And then of course our vendors and payables area. So let me get out of here real quick. So, you know, we've kind of covered how to modify existing roles. Now you do have the option to start from scratch if you wanted to create a brand new role. Let's see if I can type here. And let's say that I wanted someone to only be able to enter in purchase orders. So they have full rights to purchase orders, but that's it. I can create that role, purchasing new, and I'm going to come over here to my user list, and I'm just going to add a user here. And then I'm going to assign that purchasing new role to Kat. We'll circle back on that in a second. Now, normally, when we're walking through this with clients, we're not starting from scratch because you can see there's, you know, I don't know, like 100 and some odd permissions that are in that list. So usually what we're doing is taking an existing role, say accounts receivable, and once we've identified, you know, maybe we have 3 users that are going to be in this accounts receivable role, but we have one user that needs a little bit more elevated permissions, then we can also duplicate that role. So it'll copy everything that's in that existing accounts receivable role. And then you can see it's putting dupe 1 up here. So I'm just going to make this accounts receivable new. And then let's say we also wanted this user to have access to bank feeds as an example. So we have somebody that they do all the AR functions, but they also do bank feeds for us. So we could add that. So once we have kind of our roles defined, then you can start setting up users and assigning roles to those users. Now, you can have multiple users assigned to the same role, and you can also have multiple roles assigned to the same user. So what that means is, I'm in here right now. If I edit Kat, and let's say I have purchasing new, and then I also want to give Kat access to accounts payable, then I can do that. If I have rights, if Kat logged in and she's got rights to do something within either of these roles, then she's going to have access to do it. So it doesn't have to be, both of those roles have to be exactly the same. You can definitely, you know, mix and match a little bit. So in the scenario of, you know, maybe you have somebody that they are in the accounts payable function, but they also service backup on AR or something like that, you could give them access to both of those areas. So I'm going to edit this one more time. I'm going to take off purchasing new. So you kind of want to think about who's on your team, right? What transactions they would need access to, what lists they might need access to, whether it's just to view or modify and create, right, accounts in the chart of accounts as an example. We talked about that before you start looking at these roles. And if, there's one that's not anything like what you need, then you can definitely create a brand new one from scratch. But the recommendation is to kind of start with one that's close and then modify from there. Now I'm going to pause here for a moment, and I'm going to actually log in as Kat here. Okay, so I'm going to get logged in as Kat now. And it's going to prompt me to reset my password, right? So when you're initially setting up those users, you get to set up their password, and then they get prompted to add a new one. So I'm just going in here and adding that. Okay. All right, so now I'm logged in as Kat to this file. And if you remember, I only gave myself access to purchase orders. So I can come into purchase orders. I can pick a vendor that I have in my list. I can add the items that I might need. Right, I gave full access to purchase orders. So if I wanted to modify this one or delete it entirely, I've got access to do that, right? Because I've got full access to purchase orders. Like you'll notice, right, even though I'm logged in as Kat and I've only got access to purchase orders, I do see everything else on the home screen. So the user interface is going to look exactly the same, regardless of what your permissions are. But as soon as I try to go to an area that I don't have access to, I'm going to get a pop-up that says, I need access to view under enter bills to even click into that area. So when we're initially starting in QuickBooks Enterprise, or maybe we've upgraded a client from Pro or Premier into Enterprise, because we can get a lot more granular with those user rights and roles, and you can too, right, when you're setting them up. It's important to just let your users know, hey, if there's something that you're trying to do and you're getting a pop-up that says you can't do it, getting a copy or a screenshot of this will help your QuickBooks admin determine what needs to be added for that particular user, if it is part of their function, right? We also use user rights and roles, not just to, restrict duties to be assigned to one person or another, but we also might use them as a means to control workflow. So if, we have a client that they're used to posting everything in as a journal entry, then, and we want them to use bills and invoices, right? Because that's going to give them more details around those entries. Then we might restrict them and say they can't post anything as a journal entry, right? They don't have access to journal entries. So then it kind of drives that behavior of that user to follow the proper workflows. So again, like splitting up duties 100%, that's kind of what they're there for. But again, we can also use them to restrict workflow. If there's something somebody needs to enter in a certain way, then you can only give them access to enter it in that way. So then they're kind of forced to follow that process. Let me go ahead and log back in as our admin user here. All right, so I'm going to log back in as admin because I did want to cover a couple other tips and tricks, some things that I've noticed just in working with clients on setting these up. All right, so when I come into, I'm going to log back in here. Okay, so another thing that I wanted to point out is occasionally when QuickBooks will roll out new features in QuickBooks Enterprise, they don't always update all of the permissions that are that would touch some of those new features. So as an example, I'm logged in as the admin user right now, and one of the things that they rolled out a few versions back is our income tracker. So the income tracker is a super easy way to quickly see at a glance if we have any open invoices, overdue invoices, maybe we have some sales orders that are not closed out, or whatever estimates we have. So it can be very useful instead of going to, 1, 2, 5, 6 different reports, right? We can see that all right here. However, if you have a full access user, if I go to users, set up users and roles again, and I look at my role list and I go over to that full access user, you would assume that full access would give somebody access to everything. But if we look at that, we can clearly see that it doesn't, right? So there's some accounting tools that it does not have access to, right? When you start a new file and you get that full access user, it also does not have access to the income tracker or the bill tracker, which is kind of the income tracker, but for vendors. So those are also some areas that you might want to take a look at because, obviously if we want somebody to be able to access those, we have to grant those separately, even if we do give them that full access role. All right, another one that we also talk about is we'll also usually see quite a few memorized reports in the memorized reports list. So sometimes we want to be very, again, strategic about what reports are showing up in that memorized reports list. Users that have access to create reports, they can always add them to their icon bar without them actually showing up on that memorized reports list. So that's another area that sometimes we, don't have as much access there, so that everybody's not saving a bunch of extra reports to that memorized reports list. As you know, if you create a report in QuickBooks and you make any sort of modifications, it's going to pop up and try to get you to memorize that report. So oftentimes users will just say, okay, and then you end up with 500 reports in that list. So another area that you can kind of pin down. All right. So that takes us to the end of our webinar for today. As always, if you have any questions in the material that we covered today, or any future topics you would like for us to cover, don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks so much.